All right, so now you've prepared for this session. Now it's time to actually do the mapping session itself. So what are some things to be thinking about as you facilitate this session? So ideally, when we're doing our mapping, the most ideal scenario would be that we would actually walk the process. So walking the process with an 11 by 17 sheet of paper and actually mapping it as you walk the process is the ideal scenario. Now that's not typically the case. I find that that's very rare in most of the VSMs I work on, that we can actually walk the process, or in some cases if you're dealing with, say, a transactional type process that's in an office and you're just walking cubicle to cubicle, it may not make sense to physically walk the process, but if at all possible, walk it, because then you can actually see what's truly happening in the process as you're mapping it. If you can't do that, that's going to be part of what we do after the map, is to go out and validate what we mapped is really what's taking place. So if possible, walk it, map it at the same time. Now, how you actually create the map is really individually up to your team and your culture. Some of the groups I work with that are very IT-based organizations don't mind doing this on a computer screen and sitting and staring at a computer screen and creating the map, for several hours is something that they can handle, because that's the environment they work in. But I find most of the time what works the best is to use a big piece of paper with post-it notes, because this allows you to move things around. It allows people to stand up, because these are long sessions that you're going to be having, doing these mapping sessions, and sitting in a chair for hours and hours becomes a little draining as well. So normally what I do when I do these sessions is I have a big piece of paper I'll roll out, and I'll have post-it notes, and I'll have those color-coded ahead of time to know that there's some coherent reason why they might be yellow, green, or pink, or whatever color you decide to choose, so that you can start to see a little bit of a logic in the way things flow. And then it's just a matter of going to work on writing on the post-its and mapping out the process, which we'll actually get into the step-by-step approach to how do we map and how do we create the map. That'll be something that I'm going to have a separate video for as well, to show you how to physically map out a process electronically, which you can translate into doing it with post-its. So this is before the event, you want to figure out how are you going to do this. Have all this prepared so when you come into the event, the paper's up, everything is ready to go. Then actually just building your VSM. And now when you build your VSM, there's some basic steps that we typically follow. We always start with the customer on the upper right hand side of the value stream map. We always start with the customer. I typically will then move to the supplier and use those two to establish what I call my bookend. So I know where I'm starting with my supplier, I know where I'm finishing with my customer. Then I'll fill in the blanks below with the process steps and fill in the information flow and the data timeline, and I'll get into the details of actually doing this, and you'll be able to see me creating a map here in one of the videos that's upcoming. And so actually just working through that process, customer, supplier, the process steps, information flow, and data are typically the steps that I use to build the VSM. And then from this, once we've got the map complete, and it doesn't need to be perfect. I mean, we're shooting for 75–80% accuracy here, so don't get too bogged down in the details. Whether it's a 1 minute cycle time or a 1:20 cycle time, don't get down into those details. Get it close enough to where we can see the opportunities, and that becomes the next step. Once we've got the map complete, now we need to take a step back and say, okay, where are the opportunities here? And this is where you can break out your downtime tools, where you can just list out, the downtime acronym and go through and say, okay, let's work through all these areas within the process map here, the value stream map, and look at where do we have defects, where do we have overproduction, where do we have waiting. And you can use the downtime acronym as one way to just go through and see where do we have opportunities to reduce waste. Some of the things are going to become really apparent where you've got opportunity to remove waste and streamline the process, where you've got the greatest cycle times or the most volume of inventory, where you tend to have most problems. And however you do it, you're going to end up with this list of opportunities, and you're going to have to prioritize those opportunities. And there's different ways you can do this. You can set up some scoring criteria for how big of an impact does it have on the organization, how much of an effort is it going to take to implement it. How you do that is up to you, but I would suggest keeping it simple, maybe 1 or 2 criteria. Don't get too in depth on evaluating every potential opportunity by 5 or 6 different metrics. I typically look at impact and effort is typically where I start, maybe from a financial perspective. How big of an impact is it going to have on us? Maybe how big of an impact is it going to have on speeding up our cycle time and getting from start to finish quicker, or alleviating some issues that a customer might be having. So we're going to identify the opportunities, And then we're going to prioritize those. And there's a couple ways you can do this. You can just simply go through and prioritize from 1 to whatever number you've got. Another way that I've done this is breaking them up into different levels or different tiers. So a tier 1 group of problems might have a really high impact with little effort. A tier 2 may have maybe a mid impact with a bit more effort. And a tier 3 might be having maybe a minimal impact with a lot of effort. So it becomes a little bit easier to kind of group them up into different categories as opposed to just a straight up score, because you're going to end up having lots of ties, and so it's just a matter of understanding what are the top opportunities and narrowing down your list to that handful of big hitters. And then the last step is presenting this out to your champion or the executive or the manager of this value stream. And now they may or may not be in the session with you. A lot of times I like to have them outside of the session because sometimes they have a lot of influence on the people in the session, especially when you're coming up with ideas. Everybody's always going to be looking to him or her to see if they agree with their assessment where the opportunities are. So I typically like to have the champion or the executive or the leader of this value stream that we're mapping not come to the actual session, and instead have them come at the end and have the team walk through the process of how they arrived at this short list of opportunities. And so that's typically the last step in the actual event. So with that, now we're going to focus in the next video on what to do after the session. How do we take this and turn it into action and take the next step.